Well, Pope Francis back at the Vatican today after a whirlwind 6-day trip to the U.S. Now, his trip being considered a resounding success by just about everybody, covered a tremendous amount of ground and spread his message of hope, redemption, and peace wherever he went. And the pontiff, he met with many people who helped him drive that message home. Now, in Philadelphia just yesterday, the pontiff, he met with a whole bunch of folks, hundreds of thousands of people, but also specific constituencies, like dozens of inmates. He spoke to them about the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation. He said he was there not only as a pastor, but as a brother. And on Friday afternoon, the Pope visited an East Harlem school to meet school kids and immigrant families. He also, of course, spoke in front of Congress, the United Nations, and spoke passionately about issues like immigration and climate change, issues near and dear to his heart. And he also met with several victims of sexual abuse by clergy. And here's what he had to say after that private meeting.
And
it continues to be on my mind that people who had the responsibility to take care of these tender ones violated that trust and caused them great pain.
Dios llora.
God weeps.
Now the question is, with all of the messaging and not just the imagery, but the substance that came along with it, in addition to that, will it lead to lasting change, both doctrinal and otherwise? Let's bring in our panel right now. Michael Tobman, independent political consultant; Dominic Carter, political journalist and author; Jessica Pratt, a Republican strategist and PR expert with the November team; and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And before I get into some of the policy stuff, just imagery. Dom, was there a particular moment in this past week that stood out to you?
I think by far one of them happened to be when the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, went to Harlem and visited the immigrant community, those school kids, the reception that he received as he walked up, and those kids were clapping almost like a rock star had arrived. And I think at the end of the day that certainly all of what he did from Philly to Washington to New York is going to definitely lead to an increased loyalty to the Catholic Church.
East 112th Street, the idea that a pope would go there, something else. How about you, Michael?
I think it encourages people to explore and spend more time and with the better parts of their nature. I think a lot of people want to forgive and be forgiven and be compassionate and be more understanding with one another. And I hope that does have policy implications and policy consequences. I'm not terribly optimistic, but it'd be nice if it lasted.
I want to get into in a second about what it was about him that resonated with folks so much, but any particular moments that stood out to you?
For me, the most poignant moment was him down at Ground Zero, standing at the memorial and really downstairs inside the museum with the multi-denominational service that they had with leaders from all different religions. And it really struck me. And of course, him out in the crowds. It's one thing to be standing behind a lectern, delivering a homily, but seeing him out in the crowds and the people's response to him was just, you couldn't help but get a little emotional about it.
I go back to the parade through Washington where there was the little girl who somehow got over the railing and Secret Service was trying to get her back to her family, and the Pope's like, no, come here. I mean, it seemed like such a real moment, and sort of symbolic of who he seems to be. The rules can wait. I want to have some one-on-one contact here.
Well, he had a similar moment like that in Philadelphia where there was a 10-year-old boy that was severely disabled, and he stopped the car, got out, and had another private moment with him. Obviously, a lot of people spoke. The first leg of the trip was in D.C. And Michael, listen, wherever you were, forget your religious persuasion, forget even your politics, and obviously there's some policy that was involved there. But he seemed to resonate where you could agree or disagree, but you didn't question where he's coming from. There seemed to be, the five of us are cynics here, we do this on a daily basis, but you believed in the authenticity of where he was coming from. You didn't have to sign up to it at the end of the day, but you believed that he was coming from a better place. Is there a message here that if people pay attention, even in public life, that there was something to it? That too many times I think people think that people are coming with hidden agendas and whatever else, and they're discounted before they even get a word out of their mouth. Nobody ever accused him of that.
I think with the passing of Nelson Mandela recently, that Pope Francis is now the preeminent world leader on issues of morality and compassion in ways that I believe are beyond reproach. It used to be the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan had a role like that. He's no longer on the scene. I really do believe Pope Francis is unique in that way, that people of any denomination respond to, I think, because of the authenticity and because it's so heartfelt. And I think people project onto this Pope things they want to see, and I think that it reflects back on them in a very positive way. So I'd agree with all of that, and I think he's unique in the world in that way right now.
Any takeaways from it? I mean, I don't want to ever put him and Trump in the same sentence, but the idea that some people look at him and say, well, he says what he means in a much different way. Please, I'm not condoning the two, but in a way that people say, I don't have to read between the lines. I know where he's coming from on this, and the messaging of feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and I'm not going to get into the whole scripture of it, but you get my drift.
Well, I think, what was particularly interesting to me was, in a place like New York or other urban areas like on the East and West Coast, there tends to be this, in many populations, dismissiveness of religion. And I think in a lot of ways he kind of made it cool to be okay with being a Catholic again. And, it's not, regardless of what your politics are, and he kind of offered something to everybody, I thought. And you don't have to agree with all of it. But he talked about how, the politics are about people, and at the end of the day, it really did boil down to like, what are we all doing here, and how are we, doing our part? He talked about the dignity of having a job and everyone, providing for their family, and I thought that was just like a very great moment to pause and say, like, okay, am I pulling my weight here? What am I doing to leave a lasting legacy?
To your point, there certainly has been a Paul, you and I know from our church, that for the last 10, 15 years, certainly with the abuse scandal, how horrifically it was handled, and not only mishandled, but aided and abetted sometimes by leadership in the church. And while certainly there wasn't a shame attached to the faith, it wasn't something you broadcast as much as you did before. I just hope, and there's been a little bit of a mixed message, that his promises of tribunals and holding people accountable, turning them over to the authorities, there's follow through to that, because I also heard some things was we want to have forgiveness even for the offenders and stuff, and I really hope it's more the former than the latter. I think people are going to be paying attention right now. We had a lot of guests, including women religious, that had been waiting for a while for this Pope to break ranks with Benedict in terms of not to do inquisitions of nuns, for crying out loud. He said some of the right things they're going to look forward to, so I think there's going to be a real close eye from those closest for follow-up to this Pope, and I think people who think there'll be doctrinal changes like this, they shouldn't hold their breath. But that said, he opened a door, and at 78 to have his kind of a schedule.
Yeah,
my God.
But one of the doors that he also opened, and a lesson for American politicians, never forgetting the poor. He made it clear that he considers the poor, if the Pope can have a constituency, I don't know if he can, but he made it clear that they're dealing with those that are less off than the rest of us, that don't turn your back on them. And it just seems that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, talking up the poor is not as popular.
Talking about morality is not popular. And when Jessica said the dignity of work, it's work as a moral imperative and with moral consequences that benefit all of society, not just your own family and your own self, instead of just an economic indicator of an improving economy.
Yeah, I thought those were warning shots of sorts, Andrew, in that he made it clear, if you think, this is his first time in his life he came to the U.S. And the route that he took to get here, he mimicked in many ways the route of an immigrant. Yes, he went to Cuba before he came to here, but he had gone up through the Latin Americas before he did. And if people paid a little bit of attention, he talked about the consumerism that drives this country. And he says, you guys are better off than anyone else in the world. And if you're not careful and you keep forgetting about people in the bottom rungs, it's going to come back and bite you. Forget about what's right or wrong. It's just not smart. And I think he didn't really, he doesn't suffer fools gladly on that front.
I mean, I can't speak to the religious teachings that he was espousing during his trip, but I just have this feeling that anything political or in terms of policy is probably going to be forgotten by a lot of people pretty quickly. I honestly don't think it's going to have I think it was a feel-good moment for the country to see him there. I don't think it's going to impact us all that much. We have a very short attention span. I think there will be some people who are moved by this, but I don't see a lot of needles being moved for a long time as a result of the Pope's visit.
It's the idea of indicting the bottom half of the country or dismissing them, when it came from him to say, not only is that not okay, that's not in keeping for those who like to espouse and you know, wave their flag of faith. That's not what the church is about. And I've been saying this forever. You go to church, it seems, at least for a long time, we hear more in the homilies about you know, abortion than we do about the whole idea of what the church was for, in no small part, which was that you are your brother's keeper and everything else. And yes, clearly the church is pro-life. I don't expect it to ever be different. That wasn't, but that in and of itself wasn't just the only message. And I think he reminded people, from my vantage point,
social and cultural issues as an organizing tool around which to grow the church and organize the church are being moved away from. In favor of poverty and social and other social issues.
An amazing 6 days. Okay, when we come back, a huge piece of news that came down Friday when everyone else's attention was focusing on the Pope was a surprise resignation. John Boehner, House Speaker, leaving Congress next month. Now, does that leave the GOP and Congress in even more turmoil? Lots more people are saying yes. We'll talk about that and much more, and also take a look at the fallout.